Supported by this research, here is the origin of chronic wasting disease in North America. It is a 100% fatal disease of deer, a slow epidemic spreading through the country. The landscape is from a recent image of the actual pen at the Fort Collins Research Facility in Colorado, where in 1967, multiple deer were first recognized as suffering from what was later named chronic wasting disease, CWD. Geo3 was used to remove some old structures in this image and add the infected deer and sheep in the adjacent pen. Sheep that had been in the pens were related to a scrapie project, a similar prion disease. The video, created with VO3, provides a good sense of what researchers at Fort Collins might have seen in the 1960s. I prompted VO to have the deer walk like zombies. Infected deer are often referred to as zombie deer. The common theory, supported by the research described here, is that scrapie from the sheep infected the deer, causing the similar CWD and the epidemic. The LLMs were great at collecting, summarizing, evaluating, and simulations that are discussed in detail here. Be careful, they make mistakes, but checking provided valuable information missed by the LLMs. Output is statistical, so even identical prompts are unlikely to produce the same results. Some information wasn't in the training, so a lot of the findings here involved human intelligence. They were unstable when there was conflicting information, such as on the origin of the disease. A step-by-step approach worked best, breaking down the problem. Before we go into the details, here's some of the findings. Scrapie symptoms in sheep were reported by 1750 in Europe. Scrapie is the most likely disease source of chronic wasting disease, according to the LLMs. It was first detected in the U.S. in 1947 in Michigan sheep. Those were traced back to England. Recently discovered European chronic wasting disease cases are different from those in North America. Mostly they're an atypical form of the disease, which is low or no contagion under normal conditions. It appears sporadically in older animals. There has been a contagious outbreak in Norway's reindeer attributed to antler cannibalism. That's gnawing down on the antlers of other live reindeer. A similar outbreak among humans, among the Kuru, ritualistic cannibalism, led to a similar outbreak of the prion disease there. There have been reports of deer with similar symptoms as early as the late 1700s in Europe. No scrapie with sheep were detected in the area around Fort Collins prior to 1967 when they recognized there was a disease. Fort Collins was a leader in the scrapie eradication program by the late 1950s, reported to have sheep from scrapie projects, and there were medical experiments with deer and sheep in shared pens. Some early simulation models on the disease history that suggest a spontaneous creation of chronic wasting disease had very little data, lacked some details about the disease spread, and importantly ignored the presence and movement of infected captive deer. Because of long incubation periods, infected deer that appeared to be healthy were transported to other facilities, spreading the disease. And there they go. 3 early infection sites of traded animals with Fort Collins are missing from USGS maps showing the disease history. Observed in the wild in 1981, chronic wasting disease was centered around Fort Collins and connected facilities into the 1990s. 3 LLMs agree that a spontaneous outbreak, as proposed for Wisconsin, are unlikely without a common cause. That's part of a spontaneous theory of the creation of the disease. So in previous research, and you can find that by searching on this title, we found that chronic wasting disease can be reliably traced back to Fort Collins for the first 40 years of the disease. So here we'll start with the step-by-step prompts that we gave to the LLMs. So first, what is chronic wasting disease? We got stable, similar, but not identical answers. These answers are compatible with most online sources. So Gemini basically says it's caused by a misfolded protein called a prion, an example of a prion there in the video. It can have devastating long-term impacts on the deer family and a risk to other species like humans. Grok says it spreads easily through direct contact, bodily fluids, or contaminated environments, a major issue with controlling this disease. ChatGPT persisting in soil and surfaces for years, an incubation period of 16 months to 3+ years. That was the reason for a lot of the spread. Animals that appeared to be healthy were transported but carried the disease with them. And here's seeing the related prion diseases that we have. As we mentioned, there's two different types of diseases, classic and atypical. Research is rapidly expanding in this, and actually the artificial intelligence has been very useful in this research. And we mentioned classic scrapie is contagious, atypical is thought to be sporadic in older animals, doesn't spread very much under natural conditions. And the next prompt, why is it important to know the origin of a disease? Similar text, similar responses from the LLMs. Gemini, we can take the right steps to protect ourselves. Grok, foundational controlling its spread and preventing outbreaks. ChatGPT, crucial for prevention and control. And importantly, avoiding misinformation. So there's a bit of a difference in the theories about how they approach this. Fort Collins theory would say we've got to focus on a management of captive herds, right? We can tie the outbreaks generally for the first 40 years to movement of deer, and generally to movement of deer has been an important issue. Even the hunted deer, there are restrictions about moving deer. Spontaneous theory, still some restrictions, but the epidemic was inevitable. The problem is this absolves the captive deer complex from responsibility. The next prompt is the big question. What is the origin of chronic wasting disease? Well, there's some conflicting information in the literature and on the internet. So Gemini, actually all three started out when I first asked this question. They said Fort Collins was a leading theory, or Grok was saying it was Fort Collins. And then as I repeated as a test for stability, then it started to bounce around. Unknown, that's actually commonly said in the press or in other sources, or possibly spontaneous or scrapie, so it bounced around. Derived from scrapie, says Grok, or unknown or spontaneous. So they're bouncing around a bit between these theories, especially spontaneous and Fort Collins, and got a little bit of attention to environmental conditions, but there was only one mention there. So unstable. And one thing I noticed that there's information that LLMs do not have access to, and that's like New York Times and Wall Street Journal articles. They're behind paywalls. I assume they're not having access to that. So they certainly didn't use that as any of the references. And those are quite important statements. New York Times saying scientists long suspected deer and related species developed chronic wasting from picking up scrapie from sheep at Fort Collins. Wall Street Journal, early on, every case could be traced back to Fort Collins, and they unwittingly sent diseased deer out to other states and also released them into wild populations. So at this point, we start to break down the prompts into more detailed step-by-step questions. So we ask, well, what disease is most likely the source of chronic wasting disease? Well, all three of the LLMs answered scrapie, right? The compelling answer, prevalent in sheep populations, most likely linked to scrapie. And there was some mention of the issues of what's going on in Europe, and we've talked about this a little bit, but most of that can be explained by local conditions. It's atypical, sporadically seen in older animals, just as we see in sheep. And we talked about the reindeer linked to cannibalism, and mad cow disease is another example. And from the next prompt, when was scrapie first reported in Colorado? So the idea there is Fort Collins was pulling fawns out of the local environment for its research facility, and possibly that was a source for the infection. Well, all three LLMs got this one wrong. Gemini said unknown. Actually, that answer was trackable. Hard to do, but tracked it down. And I posted on the internet, and then Gemini picked that up. Grok, bit of a hallucination, 1967 in Weld County, wrong location and years for chronic wasting disease. Weld County is next door to Fort Collins, and actually the USGS maps has Fort Collins in Weld County. So I asked for documentation. Grok apologized and then later made a speculation, 1940s or 50s, based on the arrival of scrapie. ChatGPT, Colorado in 1947. That's correct for the US, but not for Colorado, and later said not available. And then also in pursuing this, I found a source that quoted a 18th century writer saying, "I'm assured by persons of credit that a distemper exactly the same as rickets, scrapie, in sheep is found to have arisen in late years among some deer in some parks." In checking some of the references generated by the LLMs, we found references to simulation models indicating chronic wasting disease began in the wild. So I started this sequence of prompts by asking the LLMs to write a simulation model and generate some Python code. And all three LLMs created a standard SIR model. It's susceptibility, infected, and recovered. And over on the right is a Gemini model flowchart for what the models look like. Of the models, by far, Grok created the most complex model, and the only one actually including distance. Still, Grok was explaining very difficult to model this kind of disease spread. Here are some of the variables in the model. And one of the important ones we'll talk about is the transmission rate. Very difficult to estimate that transmission rate. And I actually ran models for much of my career and have a paper out saying, yeah, these big models, they ask for data you basically don't have. And so you've got to consider what data is available when creating those models. One of the variables that's difficult to quantify in this situation is the transmission rate, known as the basic reproductive number for the SIR models. Gemini gives the standard definition, number of new infections that would result from a single infected individual introduced into a completely susceptible population. Here's a little simulation of a simplified model. Finding values of 1.3 or greater, and all three of them found some studies for mule deer in the range of 2.2 to about 4.5. ChatGPT found a high range going up to 11. The 10 and 11 is basically involving environmental pollution. Often used as another variable, easier to track down maybe, is the number of infections per unit of time. Here's the first USGS map for chronic wasting disease. This is for disease prior to 2000. You can see Fort Collins, a little yellow dot there, and the yellow dots go up into Canada. The grayed areas are counties with infected deer. This is a section of the USGS map from 2000 around Fort Collins. And looking at the literature we went through, we found a few little errors in the USGS map. Fort Collins is not quite in the right place. It should be a little to the northwest. There are 3 facilities that traded deer with Fort Collins and all wound up with infected deer. That's the Sybil unit in Wyoming and the Kremling and Meeker units in Colorado. The first infection in the wild was in 1981, but by 1992, all the infections were within 50 kilometers of either Fort Collins or the Sybil unit. By 1995, they were all within 100 kilometers of Fort Collins. There is a published 2000 simulation by Mike Miller and others that proposes that the deer were infected actually prior to the Fort Collins infection. He estimates that the deer disease started 37 to 50 years prior. That would be before the captive disease was observed. But it's a very simple SIR model, no distance. The equations actually aren't fully specified. It actually ignores all the captive infections in some of the data, earlier data. There's no distance variable. So we used ChatGPT and Grok to re-estimate that model using the transmission rate from the mule deer study midpoint of about 3.3. So that puts the infection rate back 15 or 18 years from 1999 based on the data in the Miller model. And around the time the first infection in the wild was occurring. So this assumes a single infection, but if there's more deer infected because of the facilities, that would accelerate the transmission of the disease. And Grok also came up with the same estimate. There were 2 models, Wassenberg et al. And Janelle, also with Wattenberg, that were suggesting that the disease was in Wisconsin before it was in captive herds. So if we kind of look at the timeline for Wisconsin, during the 90s, elk and deer from infected herds were imported to Wisconsin. So when they started doing testing in 1999, by 2000, 3 wild deer were found to be infected from the hunt, and 2 deer farms were infected. Actually, they also found deer escaped from an unlicensed farm. A tree fell on the farm fence and a bunch of deer got out. They found some of the deer. One of them was positive. Some of the deer were never found. Also, there's a high infection area in 2002. And in that case, they found a carcass of a deer from a captive herd. So both of these models just ignored this information about the presence of infected deer out in these areas. Wassenberg's simulation actually only was based on 4 years of annual data, and his model came up with two estimates. It either started 36 years or 188 years before the time of his data. And he agrees, though, a large number of infected captive deer would be shortening the time since the first infection. Janelle had a little bit more data, estimates the origin around 1970, but again ignores captive deer, environmental pollution, agrees that more infections would reduce the time to origin. As one problem, they estimate the disease travels at 1.13 kilometers per mile. So this implies there were multiple outbreaks, multiple spontaneous outbreaks in Wisconsin to account for the distribution of the disease. Having spent a lot of my career painstakingly building simulation models and collecting data, I was very happy to pop some data into the LLMs and let them rip. So we used some data from Wisconsin, similar to Janelle's, with not as much detail. And here's what the LLMs came up with. Gemini estimated a start date for the disease of 1998, but complained that there wasn't enough data, and using logic deduced the origin as late 1990s. Now, it didn't specify to the LLMs that there was a long incubation period for the disease. Grok came up with 1995, but notes that something unusual was happening with the data in 2008. I did not notice that. ChatGPT came up with 1981 using logistic growth curve, but used some other models like exponential and got some variations in that answer. And actually one estimate with no explanation came out as 998 AD. And if you're still watching this video, you might be interested in the previous research here, 2021 on text mining, the origin of chronic wasting disease. This map traces the epidemic for the first 40 years reliably back to Fort Collins. The spontaneous theory as an alternative to the Fort Collins theory is supported by these two ideas that CWD is likely spontaneous because there are new spontaneous outbreaks in Europe, but the European cases so far are explainable as atypical chronic wasting disease or reindeer cannibalism. They have explanations. Simulation models for Colorado and Wisconsin indicate disease preceded captive infections, but those models are very limited in data and scope. They have unusual or unstable or conflicting output. The LLMs come up with alternative outputs. In particular, those models ignore the presence of captive deer. Given these results, we present this simulation of the spontaneous creation.